Hello and welcome to the Life is Story podcast. I'm Josh Olds, and today I'm here with Mark Galli. Mark is the former editor of Christianity Today, and he's the author of When Did We Start Forgetting About God? And he must have been pretty bored in quarantine because he agreed to talk about his book with me today. So Mark, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you. Good to hear about your show and what the type of things you're trying to do. I think it's great.
Thank you. Well, I guess when the title of the book is a question, you really can't do any better than just begin with that question. So, when did we start forgetting God?
Well, the temptation is to say December 3rd, 1958, or something like that. But the title is intended to be a teaser in the sense that there is really no start date, and if you look at it in a lot of different ways, even though I make a specific historic argument that there was a time when evangelicals, I feel, had a more passionate, intimate relationship with God, sometime in the last, couple centuries, that has drifted away, and so that we're at a state now where we do a lot of things for God, we talk about God a lot, but I'm not convinced that God is at the forefront of our heart and mind and soul and strength. And that's essentially the argument I'm making in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's not. I'm probably putting this into more explicit and blunt terms than you have it in the book. But it really is about the church, meaning the institution of the church or the rituals of the church, the building of the church, kind of taking the forefront and overshadowing the worship of God. It's really become about that, the church institution almost becoming the object of worship in many ways.
Well, there's that. There's a number of things that become these focus of our lives, and that would be the institutional church would be one form. And you would see that especially in liturgical churches. I myself am an Anglican. Mm-hmm. And you see how liturgy and the institution of the church can benefit a person's spiritual life and enhance it and make it go deeper. But you don't have to be a great spiritual director to see that it also begins to replace God. But I think for most of evangelicals, it's not the institutional church, because evangelicals have traditionally been suspicious of the church and of institutions in general. But they're very committed to the idea, and this would be one of our great strengths as evangelicals, to the idea of doing things for God and making sure that we are serving Him. And what I find, at least, whether we're worshiping or doing good works out in the world, a lot of times the things we do and how we do them and how we react to them become more of a central focus, and God begins to take a back seat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time of this interview, most churches across the country are in week 6 or whatever of shelter-in-place orders. We haven't been able to meet in person in most cases. Do you think that will change the church? Do you think that will help us or hurt us in the long term in remembering our first love?
Well, that's a really good question, and because I think it's probably going to end up working in both ways. For example, I think there are a number of people that because they are no longer going to church regularly or to a weekly small group or a number of things that churches have in order to help support our faith, I think they're going to find, I don't really need that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really add anything to my life as I thought it did. And I think what you might find is people like that will find is that the church may have been a part of their life, but maybe for not the most serious of theological reasons. Mm-hmm. And they'll begin to drift away and saying, I can worship God just as well on Sunday morning just by going for a walk around my neighborhood or going to the local forest preserve. There will be other people, though, that are desperately missing church, and I think that for those whose faith is more, more alive and more serious, if they were ever tempted to think that they could get by with virtual church, they won't be tempted by that anymore.
For sure.
I mean, people are there are Christians who are desperately missing being physically with other people. I for one have never believed that those who are really trying to pursue God will ever find virtual church very satisfying at all. And I'm happy to say that I think for those people, the coronavirus has proven that correct. People really do and want to be with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that regard, there'll be a lot of people it'll be short term. It'll be helpful for.
Mm-hmm. So let's just take the book and start at the beginning. You divide the book into three parts: the crisis, the church, and then deepening desire. So let's start with the crisis and just talk about sort of the history of evangelicalism and sort of where we got our start to now. At what point along the history of evangelicalism do you start to see this shift in terms of the church really getting away from the worship of God being primary?
Well, I think the first sign that something is deeply amiss comes in the 90s when there's a lot of talk about being there's books written about being post-evangelical. Then there's the emergent movement in which people are trying to shake off the label evangelical because they're finding some fairly serious kind of problems within the texture of the church. And I think that's a result of actually evangelicalism's success. Mm-hmm. That is to say, up until the 20s, 30s, and 40s, at least in the 20th century, evangelicalism was a marginalized faith. It was very much associated still with fundamentalism. It hadn't really broken with fundamentalism yet. And if you wanted to be a fundamentalist / evangelical, I mean, it took a fair amount of commitment because you were going to be different than a lot of your American neighbors. And it took a certain type of, I guess I just said it, commitment to do that. Well, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a surge, well, actually starting in the 50s with Billy Graham's Crusades, and actually Graham's organizational ability helping a lot of evangelical organizations found. You get this explosion of evangelical life in the U.S. You get Campus Crusade, you get InterVarsity, you get Navigators, you get various and sundry publishing houses, and then you get a president of the United States who announces that he's evangelical, Jimmy Carter in '76. Mm-hmm. So now it's become more mainline and more established faith, and therefore more popular. And evangelicals as a whole rose in terms of their socioeconomic status. They were instead of becoming blue collar workers, they started getting professional degrees. And so, like any faith that becomes mainstream and normalized, you begin to see a sapping of a lot of the spiritual energy in the group. And I think that's, I didn't really write about this part in the book as such, but I think that's some of the historic reasons for the kind of more feverish activity in the name of Christ, mm-hmm. But maybe a less devotion to Christ. Mm-hmm. I use as my kind of starting point for American evangelicalism the Great Awakening and the Second Awakenings, in which people talk about they have these experiences of God that's palpable. In other words, they're in a town in which people are feeling the presence of God as they feel. It's almost as if they feel the hot, warm, or humid air that's around them on a summer day, or he's around them. He's gusting through their lives like a gust of wind. The descriptions are just quite amazing. So, and that is not something you might describe an evangelical as a person who was either touched deeply by God or on fire for God in the 17th and 18th centuries. But certainly by the 1980s, starting in the 1980s, 1990s, it's hard to know how people would describe evangelicals, but today, 2020, I'd say most people say evangelicals are people who are conservative, really conservative Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we're understood because of our political commitments. And so something has shifted in terms of how we understand ourselves and how the surrounding world understands us.
Yeah. I know that, for myself, most of the times, if I ever have the opportunity to sort of pick at evangelicalism for any one of various reasons that it deserves to be picked on, inevitably I'll have someone say, well, you're not thinking of us, you're thinking of something in the realm of politics or sociology, and you're using that term the way that the media uses that term, or you're using that term the way politicians use that term.
Right. Yeah.
But unfortunately, the term evangelical has almost shifted from being primarily a religious badge to almost being a political badge. And is there a point when we just have to say, okay, we need a new term, like we can't redeem this, or do we still continue to fight for that term evangelical and realize that it's going to have some of that baggage with it?
Yeah, I guess I've shifted my position on that. I used to say we should try to retain the term, and there's a part of me that still says we should. I mean, there are other times and places when the word Christian itself has come under suspicion, and I'm not sure I'm willing to give that term up. But evangelical has gotten to such a state that we might be wise to figure a way out of it. The problem is, when I was editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, I gave that a great deal of thought. At least 2 or 3 times in my career there, I started making a list of other possible names that we could use, and it was for me it was impossible to come up with a different name. I think one of the things that evangelicals probably need to start doing, and it's not going to happen because evangelicals aren't just the type of people to do that, is I do think we need to shut up for a while and just stop talking and stop, in a sense, still stay engaged in society, but stop being engaged in society as evangelicals or Christians and just get engaged, and let our faith make itself known in our in the way we actually interact with people and how we live our lives. But unfortunately, we're in the habit of making sure people know that what we're doing it for God, and in a sense, it's virtue signaling, but now it's evangelical signaling. Thus, you have in the worst case scenario, you have the Evangelical for Trump rally, which happened in January this last year. Right. Would be the most obvious example of that. So I'm not concerned that the core of evangelical life and faith is ever in danger. That's the one thing I like to make clear in the book. That is to say, at its core, evangelicalism is a reform movement within the church, and there's always been evangelicals, even though they haven't used that term, almost since the beginning of the church, because the church is always in danger of letting its first love fade away. And so there's always people calling it back to its first love, that is to say, to a faith that's more vital, more personal, more real, more genuine. It's not formalistic, it's not activistic, although it can include formal liturgy, and it will include activity in the world, but mainly it's this heart thing going on of an absolute passionate love for God that motivates everything. And there will always be a group in the church that's like that. So whether contemporary evangelicalism fades away because of its political compromises, and I mean compromises on both sides. I mean, you have the evangelicals on the right who have given themselves to politics on the right to become their identity. But unfortunately, you have a reactionary movement on the left, which is desperate to show people that we can be a Democrat and be an evangelical, which both strike me as wrong-headed moves.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, if either of these groups or both of these groups fade away, I'm not particularly concerned that God will stop acting in His church to bring people to a vital and personal relationship with Him that's energized by love for Him, whether we keep the label or not. Yeah.
It's always difficult because any label is going to be co-opted by people who don't fully, fulfill the greatest definition of that label. It's going to be misused and misapplied by, any number of groups. And I think it gets really hard for people who are trying to live, this life of evangelicalism and have this relationship with God to feel like they're continually being misrepresented, everywhere that they turn. And I think for other people, they have this idea of like, okay, my church tradition is in the evangelical tradition, but they don't really have much of a sense of the history behind all of that or what it means. And I think that was a key to your book, was beginning with that history and kind of, outlining, here is the history of evangelicalism, and it kind of roots the movement in history, and even not just like ancient history, although you do go back that far, but just the history of the 20th century, because a lot of churches and aren't familiar or don't teach that sort of history. So evangelicalism kind of really feels unrooted, I think, to a lot of people. And because of that, they're seeking for their relevance and their rootedness in something in the present, which takes them obviously away from the gospel as they do so.
Yeah, a good historical example of a term that came into disfavor is the word pietist.
Mm-hmm.
The pietist movement was, for all intents and purposes, early evangelicalism, starting with the Moravians and many European branches, and it led to you read about the descriptions of early pietists, and they loved to read their Bible, they loved Jesus, they loved to pray extemporaneously. They were very passionate, but the movement turned in many quarters into kind of a legalism, and so it started getting a bad name, even though in the midst of that there were pietists who were not so legalistic.
Mm-hmm.
And some of our great theologians and philosophers in the 19th century were raised in pietist homes. Karl Barth would be one example. Soren Kierkegaard would be another.
Mm-hmm.
Barth spent his whole life then rejecting pietism for various and sundry reasons, and didn't really come back to any kind of semi-warm relationship to it till he was late in life. But some of it had to do with, and some of it had to do with how the pietists themselves began acting, and then some of it had to do with just pietism became a word like Puritanism. Puritans were another really dynamic, powerful, theologically motivated group that really were trying to change the world in the name of Christ, and the name became associated with, again, legalism, stodgy, judgmentalism.
Yeah.
And so to call someone a Puritan or a pietist today is to deeply insult them. And I think that's what's unfortunately happening with the word evangelical.
Yeah, and it all goes back to this sense of when what you're known for the most is what you do for God, or what you're trying to do for God, or the social programs that you enact, or the political programs that you follow. Rather than just the worship of God, it's always going to lead back to that sense of legalism, and that what I do saves me, or what I do is at the core. What I do for God is at the core of who I am as a Christian. And in this book, you kind of, that's kind of the main thing that you take issue with, and you say this in the book. It says, my conclusion after surveying the biblical landscape is that the church's mission is not to go out and make the world a better place, to be a blessing, to transform culture, to bring justice to the earth, to work for human flourishing. The church's destiny and purpose is to live together in love in Christ to the praise of God's glory. And I think that really struck me because almost everything that we do in the church is related to those first things. Almost every single phrase that you use is something that you'll see churches use in their mission statements or whatever. I think their work for human flourishing is key to that. Now, that's not to say those are bad things, I think, but how do we find the proper balance in working these things together and saying that it's the living together in loving Christ that then drives these other issues rather than these other issues comprising the whole of what it means to be an evangelical or to be a Christian?
Yeah, I think you've summarized kind of the most controversial point of the whole book quite well, because there is a great amount of misunderstanding. That's where I got the biggest pushback immediately when I wrote that chapter as an essay last summer from the missional people, very good people who are doing wonderful things for Christ. But to say that the mission of the church is not to change the world, another way I put it in the book is the purpose of the church is not to save the world. I'm forgetting the phrase exactly right now, but to make the world into the church in a sense. Right. The church becomes the focus, and our worshipful and prayerful relationship with God becomes the primary thing. And as you said, to work in a food closet, to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Christ, to work in the political realm for justice, I have to repeat over and over and over again that I'm not against the church doing those things. Mm-hmm. I'm against those things replacing what the church is supposed to be about. And I think one of the things we found in the coronavirus is that how important the worship life of the church is. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, even in the coronavirus, you can still do a lot of good things for God. You can write your congressman. You can work at a food closet. The people are figuring out how to do all these acts of mercy safely with social distancing. But when you take the guts out of the very center of it, the kind of the weekly worship of God, in which we basically are called to identify ourselves with Him and to focus ourselves on Him, you see that the most crucial thing about the life of the church is missing now. Mm-hmm. And that is the focus, the gathered community of Christians coming together to worship, praise, and honor and glorify God, which is, when you read the book of Revelation and you talk about the end of history, what it looks like when the writer of Revelation decided to picture that, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, of course, he pictures people worshiping.
Yeah.
He doesn't picture them doing a bunch of things. At most, there are other passages in which they are fellowshipping with one another at a wedding feast or a banquet, but in Revelation they're worshiping over and over and again. So I think the first thing has to be, let me say two things. In this book, I just hint at what does it look like. So let me back up and just say, really, the book at its heart, it's a book that says we are called to love God with all our heart, all our mind, all our soul, and all our strength. Mm-hmm. And we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. Those are the two great commandments. But those adjectives, all our mind, all our heart, all our soul, all our strength, only applies to the first commandment. That's supposed to be our highest priority. And to love God in that way doesn't mean just, we have to do good things for Him. Of course it includes that. But the way the first commandment is phrased suggests there's something intrinsically appropriate about loving God in that way that doesn't include It includes activity, but it isn't limited to activity we do for God. So the book is basically calling us to do that, and I give hints about what that should look like, but I will admit that the book is not very good at giving concrete picture of what that's going to look like, and I do want to spend more time thinking about that and talking about what does that life look like. So this book is more of a critique. I'd want to do a follow-up book on what does that love look like, other than doing good things for God, which is, of course, we're supposed to obey His commandments. Of course, that's part of loving God.
Yeah.
But to give you one example, in some ways, if we were to live that life, it wouldn't necessarily on the external look a whole lot different. That is, I still have to get up in the morning. I still say my morning prayers. I still, when I did go to work, I'm now retired, but I still try to work. That is to say, I try to write. So I try to spend some more hours in the morning reading and writing. Then I've got chores to do around the house, or I've got projects I'm doing. And I said, when life gets back to normal, there'll be groups I'll meet with. I'm doing some volunteer work for World Relief, helping refugees, especially right now. Recent refugees who just got jobs are being laid off, and we're trying to help them figure out how to get unemployment benefits. But in the midst of all that activity, which is kind of takes up our lives, what I'm hoping to inculcate is what I would call a God consciousness. Mm-hmm. That is to say, we wake up grateful to the Lord for the coming of the day. When we look out our window and we see the trees beginning to blossom, we think about God, our Creator. When we see a bunch of people milling around the streets, we think not what can they do to help them, but we feel, in a sense, God's compassion for them. So it's this God consciousness that pervades everything we do that I think I'm trying to get us to. And I'm not trying to say this is easy. I'm not trying to say that I do it. I'm trying to say this is a lifelong Christian practice that when we find ourselves not even trying to do it, something's gone amiss, and that we need to set ourselves back and figure out disciplines and practices that help us remember our first love, as the psalm puts it.
Yeah. I think what I kept coming back to when I was reading this section of the book, and another quote that I have here from my notes that really stood out to me is that you said the church is not a very efficient institution for making a difference in the world, and that like part of the sentence just taken by itself, I think it could be a very inflammatory sentence. But what that got me to thinking of is that the church needs to do that which the church can uniquely do. And instead we spend a lot of time and effort and money and resources doing things in our name, in the name of the church, that could be better done, more cheaply done, more efficiently done by other types of organizations. And, when we do those things, when we try to take credit primarily for those things, those secondary things, we lose out on that which we can uniquely do, which is the worship of God.
Yeah, I mean, a great example of that was a decade or so ago. We began to see a dramatic turn in the alleviation of poverty worldwide. Mm-hmm. I mean, the numbers were staggering at how the number of fewer people who were living on poverty, according to the United Nations. Mm-hmm. When people started doing research into what happened with this, well, the main thing that happened is that China and India, in particular, their governments opened up possibilities for essentially small businesses and large businesses to have a little more freedom to operate. Mm-hmm. They were able to take steps that made differences to millions and millions of people, and it really made a huge difference. And when I made the argument in my article at CT that the church is really not the best institution to help the poor in this sort of way. And one of the things the church can do in the midst of that is, governments being that bureaucratic as they are, they might have programs that allow businesses to get started, or they might have social programs that alleviate some of the worst aspects of poverty, food stamps and welfare and et cetera. But they tend to apply all these things so sweepingly and so impersonally. And the church can come along and kind of help people know that while you're getting money or you're getting opportunities like you never have been, we're here to kind of show you something called love in a very personal way. And I did get quite a bit of pushback from people who said that maybe the church isn't the best institution to actually solve the problem of world poverty, because they felt really hurt and insulted that they weren't going to be able to do that. And I'm thinking, no, you're, like you put it, we're not the best institution for solving a lot of these problems. We're not uniquely capable of doing that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't start a food closet. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have a homeless live in our gymnasiums one day a week, like other churches in the community do. Unfortunately, that phrase, I've noticed that phrase that we have to be the phrases that talk about transforming the world, changing the world. In fact, the most recent cover of my former magazine basically said, how can we in the coronavirus still change the world? And I just think that's the wrong question. Our job isn't to change the world. It's God's job to change the world. Our job, if anything, is to change ourselves and to love the world. The better question would be, how do we love the world in the middle of the coronavirus? How we change it? I don't think that's our job. We've got other work that's much harder to do than that. So,
one of the other illustrations from the book that really stood out to me was you spoke of, and this kind of goes back to that missional mindset and the way that most churches approach this, and you use the example of a youth pastor who's tasked with both outreach into the community, but then also discipleship of the church, and the difficulty of both bringing in unchurched people, but also over here I need to disciple those who are already in the church. And as someone who has been a youth pastor for several years now, yes, that is probably the main thing is that a lot of churches, of course, they want to reach out to the community surrounding them, and of course they want to bring people to Christ. And this is true I think for the church as a whole. But what we end up with is we end up with people in the pews. We end up with some very shallow Christians. We end up with that. We end up doing really good at the horizontal, but we never really dig deep into discipleship. And so this sort of redefinition that you have here in the book is the primary goal of the church is worship. The primary goal of the church is discipleship, is that vertical relationship, and then it can only be out of that rootedness, out of the depth of that vertical relationship, that the horizontal relationship then can have any meaning or have as much meaning and value.
Yeah, and the youth pastor example I just think is a good one. I mean, I was a youth pastor for a year as well, and with all the dynamics that went into that. Well, I was a youth pastor for a year, and then I was an associate pastor at a church in which I was responsible for youth. So it does get right to the heart of the issue very quickly in youth ministry, what the church is and isn't about. I think, and the other thing is, I think people are afraid, and I think this is a rightful thing to be afraid of. They're afraid, well, if I just concentrate on worship and we just concentrate on discipleship, we're going to end up with a bunch of selfish and self-centered people who don't care about the world. And, history shows that can happen in the life of the church. And when that happens, Mark Galli and others will write a book about how selfish we become. I don't think that's our problem. And pragmatic activists, get it done, change the world, America, that's not our temptation. Plus, I think, obviously, discipleship at its best, worship at its best. We're going to walk out of worship on Sunday going, God is just so good. God has been so good to me. God is present everywhere in the world. What can I do to help people know that? And that's you're going to walk out of the service. If you walk out self-satisfied and smug, we're people of the light and everyone else is in the land of darkness, and we're going to be like that Pharisee in Jesus' parable. But I think done well and biblically, it's going to excite. The thing we have to realize is all the reform movements of the 19th century, everything from a temperance movement to the anti-slavery movement, to the work work of Salvation Army and others in the inner city and the urban life. Those were all spawned by revivals in which people fell in love with God again.
Right. Yeah.
So they quickly degenerate when God is not at the very center and focus of those movements, but that's what gets generated when God is loved and experienced in these ways.
Yeah, the vertical can drive the horizontal, but the horizontal does not as easily drive the vertical.
Right.
The last part of the book is I guess the most practical that you get, and you talk about some different rituals within the church, the way that sort of evangelicals view the church service, and other things that we don't have time to cover them one by one. So just sort of as a whole, how do you feel like evangelical churches should change or adjust their services to sort of better reflect this vertical relationship, this primary ideal that we're going to worship God here?
That is a really good question. In terms of coming down to one thing, I don't know what I would say about that, other than I suppose when it comes to worship, I would encourage, I guess there's two groups of people we're thinking about here. One is worship leaders. And the temptation of worship leaders, believe me, I was a pastor for 10 years. I know the temptations of being a worship leader. You want people to walk out enthused for God in some way. You want them to have a deeper understanding of who God is and His love for them. The temptation always is to manipulate kind of a surface emotion in order to make people feel like something spiritual has really happened. Now that's when I was a pastor, praise music and all that sort of thing was not the rage. But now I see it. And you talk to worship leaders today, and they'll say that is it. They'll be the first to admit it's a temptation that they could get people. It's not difficult to get people on a spiritual high with contemporary music. That's not the challenge. The challenge is can you help them really meet God in that time? And how you do that, you have to talk to a worship leader. What is the difference between the church service becoming just a spiritual pep rally, or becoming a place where people deeply encounter God? You probably should have someone on your show that can talk about that, because I think they would help discern that. From a worshiper's point of view, the worshiper has to begin to come to worship with the focus being on God, not on the experience I'm about to have with God. And especially in contemporary worship services, the temptation is I want to go to church because I want to have a certain experience. I had this experience once. I have it every once in a while. I feel like I feel God. I feel like God's with me. I feel like God loves me. And I want to have that feeling again. And we just have to disabuse ourselves of that motive. Those things will happen. God is good. He's gracious. Those things will happen. But the focus should be, I'm here to worship God, to sing His praises, to listen to His word, to listen to His message and the preached word. And whether it makes me feel good or doesn't make me feel good, whether it makes me feel like I'm on a spiritual high or doesn't make me feel a spiritual high, my focus is going to be on God, who he is, what he's done for me, and as a result, what I can do for him.
Yeah.
And that's a huge difference in how you attend worship and why you attend worship.
Mm-hmm.
But I think our worship services have so trafficked in being spiritual pep rallies, that's going to be a hard frame of mind for us to shift ourselves out of. It's the same frame of mind we have to get into when we talk about our daily prayer. Mm-hmm. If we wait around on daily prayer we're not going to do daily prayer till we feel spiritually motivated to do it, or we're going to be continually critical of our daily prayer because we don't feel God. We're never going to get around to daily prayer.
Yeah.
Because it's all about us.
Mm-hmm.
And we're bored. We're bored with ourselves already. We'll only become more bored with ourselves if it's all about us and how we feel. So somehow we have to shift from that focus on the self and how the self is feeling to focusing on God and who he is and what he calls us to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that might be our reason so often for moving to these sort of horizontal focuses instead of vertical focuses, is because when we focus on sort of the more external things and we do things for God in the church, we kind of get more ready feedback. When we help the poor, for example, there's pretty ready feedback for that. That we immediately feel good about ourselves and what we've done. The people that we are helping are obviously grateful. The organization that we're working with is grateful that we're volunteering, and there's a sort of this back and forth. It makes us feel good, but the internal spiritual disciplines, prayer, Bible reading, we don't really kind of get that back and forth with God all the time, quite so much. And so it becomes very easy just to say, well, these people seem to appreciate me, more than God does, in a sense, and in the terms of because if I'm going to develop this vertical relationship, then I have to subordinate myself to God. I have to submit myself to him and not be the focus. But for these external horizontal relationships, I can maintain myself being the focus. And as a human being full of pride, that's a much easier thing. It's a much easier thing to do and keep doing because it helps us retain the focus on ourselves. Those internal disciplines have to have the focus on God. They just have to.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons, one of the dynamics that's going on with the spiritual life is that there are seasons in which God, in a sense, removes his palpable presence from us. I mean, it's not an untypical experience for a new Christian to just feel in love with God and to be passionate about God and love reading the Bible and love praying, because God is, in fact, near to them in a special way for a lot of us. But there comes a period in the spiritual life where God, I think, deliberately withdraws his palpable presence just to help us grow and mature in our faith to the point where we're not going to depend on our feelings and not going to depend on our emotional state in order to give ourselves to him. But that's exactly when we become impatient and say, oh, this absence means there's something wrong and I need to be doing something different. Or I need to be doing something partly to cover up the emptiness of that feeling that God might not be with me. But also, like you're saying, a lot of times with God, there's no immediate feedback. He's a very frustrating character to work with. He's very elusive, as I said, as I titled one of my column series, The Elusive Presence. Mm-hmm. It's very frustrating to live with God because he just isn't there on demand like we need him to be. But we can go out and do activity, and we can get immediate results and immediate praise and immediate gratefulness and immediate sense of self-satisfaction. But to stick with God when he's not feeling like he's present, that is really, really hard. I'll be the first to admit I am not very good at that.
Yeah.
But I think it's part and parcel of the spiritual journey towards God that we have to learn to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that comes with, I'm going to get up and go to worship this morning and focus on God, whether it makes me feel good or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as a whole for this book, if a reader, if they could only take away one thing from this book, what piece of advice, what do you hope that just is the main thing that they would take away from it?
I think the main thing is just the first step toward spiritual renewal is to recognize how godless our lives really are day to day. And so I hate to have the book kind of start on the negative, but really in the spiritual life, the negative is really the most positive thing that can happen. So in this case, it would be, I make the argument early on in the first half of the book is basically showing in time after time and place after place how we manage to put God on the shelf and put the self at the center of everything. And I think we should feel free to kind of explore that and to be really, really honest with ourselves about that. Because we are in the presence of a merciful God when we're doing that. Mm-hmm. It will surprise us and shock us. Like I said in one part of the book, I've gone through periods where I not only feel like I don't love God, I'm not even sure I want to love God because I know what the demands it will make on me. Mm-hmm. And so my really honest prayer is not, God, help me to love you more, but God, help me to even want to love you more. And I think we can be free to be as really honest with God to say where our heart really is at any given moment. I mean, I think, to be honest, anybody who doesn't admit that they don't want God in their lives at times, even the most devout Christian, because God is such a pest. He wants so much of us. Mm-hmm. He wants every ounce of our energy, every ounce of our love, every ounce of our heart, every ounce of our mind. And if I'm typical, I rebel against that a lot of days. Yeah. I just do not want someone to take over my life in that sort of way. And I think the first thing I'd like people to see from this book is that that's the type of human being I am. That's the type of human being Christ died for. That's the type of human being that God is staying in touch with. That is the type of human being that God wants to transform. But that's got to be the starting place, a complete and utterly honest admission that we are far, far from the kingdom of God in that respect. And that's when God can really begin to work with us.
Yeah, yeah. All right, one last question for you, and I think I'd be remiss if I just didn't touch on this while I have you here. Is the when we first set up this interview and I was telling people, hey, I'm going to interview Mark Galli, everyone said, are you going to talk about the article that he wrote? And I don't even have to say which article.
The article, yeah.
The article. And,
the editorial, yeah.
I'm like, I feel like you've talked about it so much on platforms that are infinitely larger than this one. So the only thing that I want to ask you about it is, with the benefit of hindsight, and now being several months past it, is there anything that you look back and say, man, I wish I would have done that a little differently?
Well, of course, yes. And the answer is always yes and no in journalism. There's nothing I've ever written or published that I haven't looked back and said, what was I thinking? I could have done that differently. So yeah, there are aspects of that I think I could have made clearer. One thing I didn't make clear, for example, was I tended to throw all evangelicals who supported Trump under the same bus. And I think I could have made it clear that the editorial was really about what I thought was the idolatry or the false devotion of a fairly small group of evangelical Trump supporters who really are blinded by, I don't know what, but can't seem to even admit that he has moral failings, serious, profound moral failings, and that their unwillingness to talk about that or mention it or defend those moral failings are actually good, that's a serious problem for the gospel and a serious problem for evangelicalism. But that only constitutes some of Trump's evangelical supporters. There's another group who feel like they are between a rock and a hard place. They find themselves, in the 2016 election, they found themselves deeply disturbed by what Hillary Clinton stood for and how she was presenting herself. They were not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. and they didn't feel like they wanted to throw away their vote. And they went to the polling booth, in a sense, holding their nose. The voting booth, holding their nose, and they cast their vote for Trump in that light. And I get that. I'm not a political idealist. I guess sometimes you have to make hard choices. That isn't the choice I made. I voted for a third party myself. But I get it when some people have to make that choice. So it wasn't really that group of people that I'm saying is bringing shame to the name of Christ or evangelicalism. My argument is with the people, like the people who came to the Evangelical Trump rally in January, right after that editorial, who basically, when they gathered, you should at some point read the transcript of the opening prayers of that gathering. First of all, to come together, to use the name evangelical to identify with Trump, evangelicals for Trump, rather than, that's just a denigration of the name evangelical, that we're going to put it in the service of a political candidate, left or right. That's just terrible. But then to hear their prayers for the president, they were comparing him inadvertently. I don't think they were doing this consciously, but inadvertently comparing him to the Messiah, to Jesus Christ. One prayer ended with, "We thank you, Father, that Donald Trump sits at the right hand of the Father." Well, I think I understand what the pastor was trying to say there, because in some sense we all sit at the right hand of the Father because of what Christ has done for us. But because he didn't qualify in any way, it really comes across like Donald Trump is the new Messiah and can do no wrong. And it's this type of evangelical for support for Trump that I think is a deep, deep problem. And I would make the same accusation for anybody on the left who supports a candidate on the left in such messianic terms. It's a grave, grave misunderstanding. So I think probably the main thing I would want to make a little more clear in the editorial itself was it's when that loyalty to a candidate pushes over into idolatry and blindness to his moral failings, that it's a serious problem for our movement. And unfortunately, that still characterizes too much support for Trump in our movement.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mark, thank you for your time. Thank you for your book. I know that when I spent a couple days reading through it, it really spoke to me, really challenged me to think about how I was conducting my ministry, the way that our church was conducting its ministry, and to really try to get back to the old song, get back to the heart of worship. So again, the book is When Did We Start Forgetting About God? It released earlier this month in April of 2020. So go out. I guess, don't go out right now. Don't go out. But pick up a copy. Pick up a copy somehow. Actually, support your local independent bookseller. Contact them. They'll know how to get a hold of the book. They'll get it for you. So again, Mark, thank you for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I appreciate what you're trying to do with your podcast and your blog.